This is Brett the Hitman Hart, and you're watching another original wrestling documentary.
Stampede Wrestling was a Canadian professional wrestling promotion based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. For nearly 50 years, it was one of the main promotions in Western Canada and the Canadian prairies. Established by Larry Tillman in 1948 and later sold to Stu Hart, the promotion competed with other promotions such as NWA All-Star Wrestling in Vancouver and Pacific Northwest Wrestling in Portland. Stampede Wrestling regularly ran events in Calgary's Victoria Pavilion and the Stampede Corral between 1948 and 1984. Bought out by promoter Vince McMahon, the company was briefly owned by the World Wrestling Federation before being relaunched by the Hart family the following year. Run by Bruce Hart until 1990, he and Ross Hart reopened the promotion in 1999 and began running events in the Alberta area. Also with its wrestling school known as The Dungeon, many of the promotion's former alumni became some of the greatest stars in the history of professional wrestling. The promotion produced one of the earliest televised professional wrestling programs that remained one of Calgary's most popular sports programs, eventually airing in over 50 countries worldwide. This is the untold story of Calgary Stampede Wrestling. It was 1905, as Alberta is finally declared a province. Ottawa Silver 7 beats Dawson City Nuggets 23-2 for the Stanley Cup in the most lopsided playoff game in NHL history. The New York Giants beat the Philadelphia A's 4-1 in the Second World Series. A physics journal publishes a paper by Albert Einstein introducing the equation E=mc². And regular catch wrestling exhibitions began being held on a weekly basis at the Sherman Lyric Theatre in the Theatre District of downtown Calgary. The area was frequented by such stars as Yankee Rogers, Jack Curran, Tony Harris, and Frank McDonald. Catch as catch can is a style of wrestling in which all holds are permitted, unlike Greco-Roman in which only holds below the waist were allowed. Around the turn of the century, it was common to have both Greco-Roman and catch-as-can styles of wrestling and even boxing all on the same card. On Tuesday, November 29, 1910, at the Starland in Calgary, moving pictures were shown of Frank Gotch battling Stanislaus Zbyszko. Some would describe this very first event in which wrestling from another location was shown in a public theater, a precursor to closed-circuit TV. Even Charles Cutler and Yusuf Hussein took their feud all over North America, stopping in Calgary. The Majestic Theatre in Lethbridge, Alberta was also a popular stop for stars such as Nick Bozinis, Oscar Scarberry, Paul Paulson, the Red Devil, Tony Catalina, and Clem Cusack. Both boxing and wrestling cars were promoted by boxer Danny Lynch at the time, who was also accused of fixing boxing fights. Wrestling in this era didn't come without scrutiny and its share of non-believers. A terrible headlock used by Ed Strangler Lewis in 1921 put the whole wrestling game under a microscope. Stu Hart wore many hats throughout his life. Along with being a professional wrestler, he was also a booker, promoter, coach, trainer, football player, amateur wrestler, and even a sailor, but he is best known for founding and handling Stampede Wrestling. His amateur career peaked in May 1940 when he won the Dominion Amateur Wrestling Championship in the light heavyweight category. Stu qualified and would have competed at the Summer Olympics in Helsinki in 1940, but could not due to it being cancelled because of the outbreak of World War II, which was a terrible blow to Stu Hart personally, as it had been his dream to compete at the Olympics from a very young age. But what might have seemed like a tragedy at the time turned out to be one of the greatest windfalls for the world of professional wrestling. Stu began wrestling professionally in 1943 with the Royal Canadian Navy while serving in World War II. After leaving the service in 1946 and receiving training from Toots Mondt, he made his way to America and debuted professionally in New York for the Capital Wrestling Corporation. Stu was very popular with the female audience and a good in-ring performer. The roughing up of young performers by veteran workers was common at the time in the industry, but Stu adapted to it rather quickly and would retaliate with the same treatment, utilizing his catch wrestling experience to his advantage. He also developed a reputation as a legitimate athlete and a tough guy in the business. Stu was a frequent tag team wrestler. Together with Lord James Blears, they lived together for 6 months with another wrestler named Sandor Kovacs, whom Stu already knew from the Navy, who in later years would run the Vancouver territory with Gene Kiniski, called All-Star Wrestling. After marrying Helen Smith, whom he met in New York City, Stu moved back to Canada in 1947. Stu had quickly become a rising star in the area, but chose to leave together with his newly engaged fiancée to start a family only about a year and a half after debuting. In September 1948, Stu Hart established Klondike Wrestling in Edmonton. In 1950, he wrestled for the NWA Associated Alex Turk Promotions in Winnipeg. The first match was against Vern Gagne on June 29th at the Civic Auditorium. The match resulted in a draw. In 1951, Stu then purchased a mansion in the Patterson Heights area of Calgary for $25,000. The Hart House, which is now considered a heritage site, its basement later known as the Dungeon, provided training grounds for his wrestling pupils. Later that year, Stu headlined an event in Wisconsin, again together with Vern Gagne. He was still favored by women at this time, even against a bigger star like Gagne. Larry Tillman was one of the first prominent wrestlers within the National Wrestling Alliance, competing from at least 1934 until 1950. During his in-ring career, he had memorable feuds with wrestlers including Freddie Blassie, Sonny Myers, Stu Hart, Ken Fenelon, and Dan O'Connor, from whom he captured the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Championship on January 1st, 1946. At the 4th NWA Members Convention in September 1951, Larry was approved as a promoter within the National Wrestling Alliance for a territory spanning the U.S. Pacific Northwest to Western Canada, including Calgary. Stu Hart was one of the mainstays of Tillman's territory and would eventually work as a booker. In 1951, Tillman sold Stu the territory for $50,000, allowing him to take over the NWA membership for Calgary. Stu would rename the territory Big Time Wrestling, then Wildcat Wrestling, before eventually calling it Stampede Wrestling. Through its duration, it operated under the parent company, Foothills Athletic Club. In the beginning, like many other territories, Stampede Wrestling received little or no help from the National Wrestling Alliance. Through the 1950s, Stu Hart still pulled triple duty as booker, wrestler, and promoter, along with other stars such as Pat McGill, Jerry Meeker, Al Mills, Lou Newman, Chief Thunderbird, and Dave Rule. While at his CHCT news job, Stu Hart asked Ed Whalen to work for him on the Stampede Wrestling Show. Whalen gained worldwide fame for being the ringside announcer from 1958 to 1989. The show popularized several Whalen catchphrases, including his trademark sign-off, "In the meantime and in between time." According to Ross Hart, Whalen along with Helen Hart were the only classy elements of the wrestling business, stating that Whalen and she added dignity to Stampede Wrestling. In October 1969, Stu Hart was chosen Personality of the Week in the Calgary Herald, which featured him and Helen on a full-page write-up which documented Stu's life from a young man and humble roots, living a nomadic existence on farms and ranches in Saskatchewan and Alberta throughout the 1920s. The TV show was filmed at the Victoria Pavilion on Friday nights, and highlights were shown Saturday on TV in an hour-long episode, which attracted more than 100,000 viewers. The show was syndicated and replayed on Channel 2 late Monday night. During the 1970s, the area was frequented by stars such as Dory Funk Jr., Harley Race, Angelo Mosca, Billy Robinson, Abdullah the Butcher, and women's champion Betty Nicoli. In September 1972, Stampede Wrestling held its first ever ladder match between Dan Crawford and Tor Kamada, where the object to be grabbed was a wad of money. Dan Crawford, the Canadian hero, and Tor Kamada had been drawing great houses for the promotion. When attendance started to fade as the months went by, Crawford began to brainstorm ideas to bring fans back. He came up with the idea of an object being suspended above the ring and the competitors using a ladder to reach it in order to get the victory. Stu Hart loved the idea and the ladder match was officially born. Hans-Jochen Hermann helped to bring the soccer-style penalty card system to Stampede Wrestling, putting a unique spin on otherwise typical matches. A total of 2 yellow cards would be displayed by officials for less serious infractions. A third offense or any major offense would result in a red card or an automatic disqualification. Black cards would be displayed for the most serious offenses, resulting in suspensions. This arrangement was designed to give the referees more authority and control in the often wild Stampede matches. In the early to mid 1980s, Stampede Wrestling produced some of the top talent which would go on to Vince McMahon's WWF and dominate the wrestling scene. Stars such as Davey Boy Smith, the Dynamite Kid, Bad News Allen, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, the Honky Tonk Man, Bret Hart, and later Brian Pillman, Maka Singh, and Owen Hart. In 1981, teenage English wrestling phenomenon Davey Boy Smith challenged mid-heavyweight champion the Dynamite Kid for the title, in which Dynamite Kid came out on top 2 falls to 1. By 1984, Davey Boy and Dynamite settled their on-air feud and quickly became Stampede International Tag Team Champions and dominated the tag team scene, which they would do for most of the 1980s in the WWF, New Japan Pro Wrestling, All Japan Pro Wrestling, then later would return to Stampede Wrestling. The British Bulldogs are still to this day considered one of the best tag teams of all times, and the Dynamite Kid is credited for single-handedly creating a high-impact style of wrestling that's arguably influenced every facet of professional wrestling. Stampede Wrestling was operated by Stu Hart until 1984 and was a member of the NWA the whole time. Harley Race and other NWA champions would routinely travel to Calgary and defend their title during the Calgary Stampede. During the early 1980s, when the NWA Championship was held by Dusty Rhodes, Rhodes was unavailable because the plan was to drop the belt to Ric Flair in September of that year, and didn't have time to hit every territory. Stu Hart then contacted the AWA and had Nick Bockwinkel fly in to face challenger Bret Hart. Also on the card for the World Mid-Heavyweight title, challenger Davey Boy Smith faced the Dynamite Kid. Duke Myers faced Dr. D. David Schultz, and Bad News Allen faced Jerry Morrow. Even Bruno Sammartino wrestled at the Calgary Stampede during the 1960s. During the 70s and 80s, Stampede Wrestling could be seen on Channel 2 and 7, CFRN Channel 3 in Edmonton, CKVR in Ontario, and later CKVU in Vancouver. The televised version of Stu Hart's wrestling shows were one of Canada's longest-running television programs, lasting over 30 years and remained one of Calgary's most popular sports programs, eventually airing in over 50 countries worldwide. When Stu Hart reportedly caught kids trying to sneak into the shows, he would let them in free of charge and try and help them out instead. In 1983, a riot broke out during a match at the Ogden Auditorium in Calgary during a match between Bret Hart, Davey Boy Smith, and Sonny Two Rivers against Bad News Allen, the Stomper, and Stomper's on-air son, Jeff Gouldy. Longtime Stampede announcer Ed Whalen reportedly became distraught during the riot, in which a woman was trampled, which caused him to quit from Stampede on air. Speaking on the events, he remarked, "We're starting to scare the patrons with this violence outside the ring, and I will not be associated with it anymore." The event led to Stampede Wrestling being banned from Calgary for 6 months by the city's Wrestling and Boxing Commission, and within a year the operation was sold to the World Wrestling Federation. Simply known as the Dungeon, The gym and wrestling school located in the basement of the Hart Mansion, the school was created by Stu Hart and is known for having produced some of the greatest and most successful professional wrestlers of all time. The school trained a number of WCW, ECW, WWF, and Japanese stars. When Stu Hart purchased the Patterson Heights Mansion in 1951, he transformed its basement into his personal training center shortly thereafter. Although the nickname itself developed over time when Stampede Wrestling became world famous. Aside from professional wrestlers, the dungeon provided training grounds for various athletes from strongmen to football players. The majority of Hart's sons trained in the dungeon and went on to become involved in the wrestling world. Other dungeon graduates included Billy Graham, Greg Valentine, Bad News Allen, Davey Boy Smith, Brian Pillman, Ricky Fuji, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Justin Credible, Edge, Christian, and Mark Henry. Natalia, daughter of Jim Neidhart and granddaughter of Stu, was the first ever woman to graduate from the dungeon. The final graduate of the Hart Dungeon was TJ Wilson. One of the first televised acknowledgments of the nickname The Dungeon was by then WWF color commentator Jesse Ventura. Its first significant exposure was in the documentary Wrestling with Shadows. In it, the dungeon was moderately filmed for the first time, and Stu Hart is shown demonstrating wrestling holds on a pupil. Bret also discusses being trained by his father and having submission holds applied to himself. A bonus feature on Bret's DVD set also shows him discussing the dungeon. Various activities took place in the dungeon, ranging from weightlifting to catch wrestling. Bret Hart has described the dungeon in interviews as having holes in the walls and ceiling from bodies being driven into them. He also noted that practices could, at times, be as intense as MMA-style fighting. In July 1998, the WWF filmed a match between Owen Hart and Ken Shamrock in the dungeon for the fully loaded pay-per-view. During the period when Stu Hart was regularly training individuals at the school, it held a reputation for being one of the harshest wrestling schools in the world. Graduating from it was considered very impressive and something in which would be brought up on air on televised wrestling shows. Stu himself also garnered a reputation for being borderline sadistic in his training techniques, and was known to torture his pupils with legitimate submission wrestling holds he had learned as a wrestling amateur. Buddy Roberts described the place as like a torture chamber. In contrast to his descendants, Stu never took money for his training services and did it mostly for the love of the art form of professional wrestling. Stampede wrestlers would all cram into broken down vans with bald tires and drive hundreds of miles across the tundra-like conditions of the Canadian prairies in the freezing cold to get to shows. Matches on TV were normally joined in progress. The reason for this is only 1 hour of wrestling and interviews would be filmed per show, therefore the beginning of the matches usually weren't even filmed. Big names of the 1980s included the Cuban Assassin, Maka Singh, Gama Singh, the Viet Cong Express, Archie Goldie, Beef Wellington, Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith, Bad News Allen, the Honky Tonk Man, Johnny Smith, J.R. Foley, Ben Bassarab, Brian Pillman, Jim Neidhart, and Keith, Bret, Owen, and Bruce Hart. During the 1980s, strongman Bill Kazmaier was trained by Vern Gagne and made his way to Stampede Wrestling, where he feuded with fellow strongman Ted Arcidi. Still a member of the National Wrestling Alliance until 1984, Stampede's main talent was plucked by the World Wrestling Federation to help develop into the major promotion it is today. In 1985, the WWF reneged on their original deal with Stu Hart, and the Harts reopened Stampede Wrestling. By 1989, Stampede had shut down, and in September 1990, Davey Boy Smith abruptly withdrew the Bulldogs from All Japan Pro Wrestling's annual World's Strongest Tag Team Determination League by returning to the WWF and competing as the British Bulldog. Johnny Smith would end up taking Davey Boy Smith's spot in the World's Strongest Tag Team Determination League, and the duo known as the British Bruisers continued to compete in All Japan Pro Wrestling. The duo managed to capture the All Asia Tag Team Championship, but the partnership was short-lived. The years of working a high-impact style had caught up with the Dynamite Kid, and he sadly announced his retirement on December 6, 1991. The promotion was reopened on April 2, 1999 by Bruce and Ross Hart. Stampede's weekly shows were again held mostly at the Victoria Pavilion in Calgary, with special events being held at the Stampede Corral. Stampede Wrestling was the basis for a long-running weekly sports broadcast produced in Calgary, showcasing many of the promotion's most popular wrestlers. At the time, Stampede was revived in 1999. A second Stampede Wrestling TV series was attempted, hosted by Bad News Allen and play-by-play commentator Mauro Ranallo, but was short-lived and Ed Whalen was not involved. When Bruce and Ross Hart reopened Stampede Wrestling after a 9-year hiatus, in 1999 it regularly showcased graduates from the Hart Dungeon Training School. However, only weeks after their first event, the promotion once again became inactive following the death of Owen Hart in May. Although considering closing the promotion, the Hart family continued to promote events 5 months later and began touring Western Canada. Bruce and Ross Hart sold Stampede Wrestling to Bill Bell in 2007. The promotion ceased operations in April 2008. In December 2015, the WWE Network began adding Stampede Wrestling shows to its Vault section. However, it was all removed a few days later after Bret Hart proved that he owned the rights to the footage of his matches, but WWE currently controls the bulk of Stampede Wrestling's extensive tape library. That was the untold story of Calgary Stampede Wrestling.